Give me great pleasure to introduce to you our Danish ambassador, Friis Arne Petersen, who we have the great privilege to visit with here this week and had a good time. And he had a chance to see a little bit of Utah and visit University of Utah, but I'm sure his visit here, the Y, would be more significant. I had to say that the other place too. Ambassador Petersen has a long career, and I wasn't going to read it all because I would take all the half hour. He has spent well over 30 years in the government of Denmark. Some of you remember Uffe Ellemann-Jensen, who was the foreign minister for Denmark. He was a secretary for Ellemann-Jensen for many years and represented him in the EU. I think significantly he also was the managing director of the foreign ministry in Denmark, and apparently did such a good job that they posted him as his first post as ambassador to America, and that says something. That usually is the crown that everybody hopes for. And now the ambassador did such a wonderful job that he gets the even bigger job, maybe, to be posted to China. He would be going to China in September and joining with John Huntsman. And we are very pleased to have Ambassador Petersen here. We wish his wife, Birgitte, also would have a chance. He has 3 children. They all live in Washington, D.C., needs to go to school and have a normal life, so they were not able to join them. But give me great pleasure to introduce you to His Excellency Ambassador Petersen.
Well, thank you so much, Niels, for those kind words, and I thought you were a little bit daring there about Utah State University, but I think you were also yourself in your own career quite balanced, because if I'm right, you studied both places. That's a wise man's approach to things, do both and prefer one. I will not dare prefer one. I will talk about Danish-US relations and the challenges that we face together in the pretty complicated world we live in still. And I will hope to be relatively short in the introduction and have a conversation with you and a discussion, because that's what I would probably learn more from than listening to myself one more time. So I will start by saying that I'm very happy that we Danes have such a wonderful bilateral relationship with the US. And I'm also happy to say that we are actually quite good at this relationship, because we are that one country in the world that has the longest unbroken relationship with the US. We established diplomatic ties in 1791, and it's unbroken till today, and I cannot foresee any incident that would change that record of ours. So we're just growing it bigger and better every single day. And that will be my theme for my presentation, that the relationship between a small country like Denmark, of course, closely integrated in the European Union foreign policy is geography. But we Danes happen to have Greenland, as you can see, a pretty big chunk that is very North Atlantic. So our outreach is even more transatlantic than the Brits, in spite of their traditions. And ours is still preserved till the very day of today, and will be, I think, for the foreseeable future. But the relationship between the US and Denmark, the US as the world's superpower as of now and for some years to go, still, I think, is actually quite broad, quite deep, quite substantial. And I've said a couple of times the last few days, when I've spent some wonderful days here learning a lot about the state of Utah, but also about the United States of America, that we Danes have only the last few years realized how flat the world in reality are for us commercially. We always did the most substantial trade with our European neighbors. Germany is our biggest market because it's the biggest European country, and it's really big for us. And foreign policy and foreign trade is very important for a small country that has its neighbors just 20 minutes away from its borders. Sweden, UK, Norway, they all used to be our most important trading partners. But the last 5-10 years, the US has climbed from being number 8, 9, 10 to now today to be number 3. I think that will continue. I don't see anything that should rupture that picture. So economically, politically, we gain a lot of, you can call it interdependence or great business, whatever it produces, a closer political understanding, and better political understanding create better political ties. And we, as I've said already to you, seem to have pretty good ties with the US. My next point will be that politically, it took a while for the US presidents to get to Denmark. I openly admit that we only had the first US president visiting Denmark in 1997. And given that you and we established ties in 1791, one could say that you are a little bit slow here in the US. We would never dare say so, because we were very happy to have the visit of President Clinton in 97. And the reasons, which is more important for him visiting Denmark, was that the end of the Cold War in 1990 allowed small NATO European allies like Denmark to be doing something we had not done since Second World War, to be of avail, to start daring do what we are now doing and very proud of doing in Denmark, namely pursuing an activist foreign policy in NATO. That's new, that's difficult, it's domestically complicated. Iraq, the Balkans, Afghanistan, all the challenges that we face inside NATO. But we Danes, we are doing that because we believe in that activism that we are pursuing. And in the 90s, we were very, I think, activist when it came to the enlargement of NATO towards the east, including the former Warsaw Pact countries, Eastern European countries. And I think it was fair, therefore, that President Clinton and his administration singled out Denmark and not some of the other possible options to go visit when we were trying to reunite and recreate Europe as one whole, free, and very important continent and partner for the US. We've since then had both the visit of President Bush in 2005. I personally was so fortunate to be the permanent secretary of the Foreign Ministry, as Niels just said, at the time, so I saw those wonderful, important political conversations between our your President Bill Clinton, our Prime Minister Rasmussen, Nyrup Rasmussen, for short we call him Rasmussen I. We are Danes, we are a monarchy, we like dynastic traditions. But I also saw the meeting between George Bush, 43, and who we could call Rasmussen II, Anders Fogh Rasmussen in 2005 as Permanent Secretary. And last year, we had 2 visits by President Obama, and Rasmussen III was very, very gracious to host him. And so we are really, you can always ask the question as Americans, you would overlook this and say, is that so terribly important as he's trying to make it, that you have visits by the US president? Well, given the record that we've only had US presidents visiting Denmark since 97, and the first 200 years were us, our kings and queens coming here to the US, means that we've stepped up the balance and the sort of symmetry in the relationship, and for good reasons. And that's the main point. It's because of identical political interests that all of a sudden seems to be working for you as a big superpower and for us as a small European ally that tries also to economically, politically profit from that new relationship that we've gained. Because if we Danes want to do something, it is to exercise influence in the international community. You will always meet as a Danish ambassador in the US, a lot of Danes everywhere. When I was in Vermont a couple of weeks ago with Bernie Sanders, maybe one of the most liberal senators in the US, trying to not interfere in your domestic health debate, but to tell about what we find is a pretty good system of what you Americans call socialized medicine in healthcare. We met Danes everywhere. And finally in the airport where we were checking in and going through the TSA procedures, there was this woman also claiming to be Dane, and Sanders, he turned to me and said, "Did you post all these people out here just for me?" And I said, no, they're just here by themselves. They just are everywhere. And that would be the same for a Danish ambassador in Bhutan or in Brasilia. You would meet Danes everywhere. And we have that in our genes. We are sort of spread around the world. We try to be everywhere, and it's not something that anybody decided. It's just the way that Danes are. And with that comes an interest for the world and an interest in pursuing political interests. And since the end of the Cold War, that has been more easily done and formulated in different Danish governments, center-right and center-left, center-right governments, foreign policy making. That's a very important point to understand when you look at Denmark and the US, that we want to pursue these interests, even with you as such a different power. The EU has to play a very important role for us Danes, because the way in which we have unified Europe is not only by enlarging NATO. It is especially, I think, thanks to the European Union and the integration method that Jean-Claude Monet, other great European thinkers in the founding fathers countries, the French, the Italians, the West Germans, the Benelux countries, actually created 60 years ago. We joined in the first wave of enlargement with the Brits and the Irish in 71, 72, and we're very proud of that. We had hoped the Norwegians would have been with us in the European Union. They are not. But we've seen a number of other enlargement waves of the European Union that has created this European Union of 27 member states that is trying to create, among many other things, common foreign policy, common defense policy, common currency policy, common justice and home affairs policies, common agricultural policies, common environmental standards, common climate policy, common policies on all those issues where a continent like Europe with 482 million people needs to cooperate and have standardized, harmonized features to make economy of scale thrive, to make us profit from the same kind of economic, technological sort of point of departures that has made the US the greatest economy of the earth. And it's probably going to make China the even bigger economy of the world in the future. So we Europeans are striving for that, because we in the European Union want to not only solidify peace, the political overarching most important objective for us Europeans, to stay peaceful, cooperating with each other, we who created so much war, so much world war, so much havoc in world history, but also to use that peace creation that the EU represents to be of economic, political avail in all other important aspects of modern life. You could, I hope, ask me about the euro afterwards. I will not use much time on that. I think it's one of the greatest examples of, not just a symbol of, but efficient tools of integration that we've created common currency. We Danes are not really member of it, and yet we are. I will elaborate on that if you want. Common defense, we Danes are not members of it because we had a referendum in which we could not ratify the treaty for being members of that common defense. 2nd of June 92, a painful day for some of us, but we are trying to be of even more avail, therefore, in NATO and in the UN, and that's a very important feature about Danish foreign policy, that we believe in both diplomacy, development assistance, but also in rendering the military contribution that in the end may be the need, not a first best solution, and certainly not if you cannot have a UN Security Council backing for it, but you would want to have that. So Denmark's global ambitions have to be seen in the context of the EU and the gradual building of a stronger, bigger EU internally with all the kind of wealth and internal policies that we create in the European Union, but also externally with the kind of new features that you see in the new treaty that we just ratified and had enter into force 1st of December, the Lisbon Treaty, so-called, last year, with two very important features. One, a president for the European Council, a former Belgian prime minister, and two, what we call a foreign representative, a type of foreign minister, Lady Ashton, who will represent the whole of the European Union. And with those two people, we think we Europeans have answered the question that Kissinger once put, namely who to call when you want to engage Europe and European Union in Brussels, namely these two very important institutions. I do think that one of the things that is oftentimes overlooked when you talk about the EU's global role is the economic role of the EU in terms of trade policy. Classically, one would say that in trade liberalizations, in the Doha development round, nothing could really happen in terms of breakthroughs except if the US and EU were together and sort of trying to break the mold. I think we're trying that as well. I think we're doing quite well. Unfortunately, we see a lot of free trade arrangements being made instead of the global free trade arrangements succeeding. We see a lot of maybe even competition between the EU and US in making the right free trade arrangement between EU, South Korea, EU, and all the new important emerging markets. You will probably recognize that the US had some difficulty in ratifying some of these agreements because the administration saw the vision and pursued it, but the Congress have not been able to follow suit and enact it for other reasons. I think that's a handicap for the US and the global economic competition in the long run, that you're not doing this in the Congress. I understand the domestic politics of this, but it's a very important part of the EU global role that we do a lot of trade policy, common trade policy. Is one of the clearly overlooked features of the EU's functioning, that we've been able to create a relatively trade liberal EU on the global scene. I will want to talk about climate policy because climate policy is a very important policy to address one of the biggest challenges of the world community. We Danes believe strongly in environmental policies, protection. We've tried to be representative of a very progressive energy policy the last 30 years. I could mention in many, many details a number of features of our energy policy, but I will only leave you with one or two. We were net importers, one could clearly say, in '73 when the first oil crisis hit us. We imported 99% of our energy from foreign sources. Today we are net exporter because of a wise, far-sighted energy policy that has made us be net exporters. We are decoupling our economic growth that is exactly the same as the US since the energy crisis. So with a growth of GDP in 67, 68% range, we've had no increase in energy consumption. That has given us, of course, a lot of economic international competitiveness, without which we could not have had the kind of export and the financing of our economy's viability long term, and therefore the support and the financing of our high standard of living. With the kind of economic activity that the world has pursued, we have created a global warming problem, and visionary energy policies will have to be the solution to that global warming problem. We were persuaded by the Clinton administration that the American administration could never have Congress accept a carbon tax system. Therefore, we bought into your cap and trade system and philosophy when we made the Kyoto Protocol and tried to make global climate conventions. We would have hoped that we would have seen a successor treaty being defined, agreed upon in the COP15, so-called COP15 meeting in Copenhagen in December last year, where 110 heads of state and heads of government participating in exactly in order to create that climate convention. Fortunately, we got a Copenhagen Accord that sort of takes as its point of departure that we have to limit the global warming to only 2 degrees Celsius. We will have to have a lot of actions, individual actions by all the 100 member states that have during the beginning of this year signed up to the Copenhagen Accord, including the US. It's going to be difficult for the US that have signed up to fulfill its own obligations, namely the 17% reductions in CO2 emissions in 2020. If the economy still will be back on track, we will have high growth in the US. The world economy will be still recovering. The CO2 emissions will have to be very, very significant and hopefully enacted by Congress in the US with a cap and trade arrangement. I would hope that would be the case. I would hope that Obama and the Democratic leadership in Congress, with some Republican support, could achieve this. I also have to be honest and candid with you and say that as of now, given the political situation in the US, I unfortunately do not really see that happening, given how difficult it has been to reach agreement on some of the other major democratic reform agenda issues. There may therefore come some very far-reaching progressive energy policies out of the legislative process in the US that could be means towards some of these political objectives of ours and yours to create a real contribution to solving the global warming problem. But the challenge for the US and for us in Europe is to make reductions in CO2 emissions that, according to science, whether you believe it or not, in the International Panel of Climate Convention, IPCC, requires the US to reduce its emissions of CO2 in 2020 by 1990 standards with 25 to 40%. Obama campaigned on a fine, big, ambitious 0%. So given the difficulties, if I may be a diplomat, that you have in Congress enacting that kind of climate legislation that I just talked about, that has been passed in the House, I should commend you for. We are really, I think, witnessing one of the biggest challenges to the global cooperation, wherein the US really needs to find out how to be an even more responsible actor. This is not something I'm paid to say. It's something I do say because I'm paid to do it as a government employee and diplomat, but it's also something I, as a person who believes in science, really clearly believe is going to be one of the biggest challenges for the global community to address. So therefore, this emphasis on this, I think the administration of yours is trying its level best, but political realities on the ground sort of restricts the real room for maneuvering. So climate policies, energy policies are really some of the issues that you will see also in a bilateral perspective. Us Danes working a lot with. I was very happy this morning to meet with your governor and to realize how interested and how preoccupied he is with having the state of Utah being engaged in as much sound energy policy as possible. And hopefully we will see some Danish companies do the kind of cooperation with the state of Utah, different private actors, as we've seen with many other states in the US. And I will have to mention a few things that is important to us in Denmark, and also will give you an idea of how deep the bilateral relationship is between the US and Denmark. We have been able to create, in the wake of the kind of energy policies I just described to you a minute ago, some of the world leaders in renewable energy. The biggest wind turbine windmill producer is a Danish company called Vestas. They invested more than $1 billion the last 4 years in the state of Colorado, making local wind turbine productions, blades, nacelles, turbines, and therefore these jobs that you here in the US calls green jobs, Obama sees as a new economic normal for the US, as one of the ingredients of. We've had quite a number of other Danish companies doing very well here, so well that President Bush visited Novozymes and its facilities in North Carolina a couple of years ago, a company that produces enzymes that will do the conversion of biomass into biofuel, and not just the corn that gives a lot of political objections and opposition, because it's also something that increases the food prices if you use corn for biofuel, but the second generation enzyme and biofuel that is pursued so vigorously, and that Novozymes as a company believes, partly thanks to its own research efforts in Denmark, in other places, and partly thanks to its research and cooperation with relevant universities and companies here in the US, already are in the midst of producing. So we will see a completely different equation, much less politically controversial, because you can start using switchgrass, other types of biomass that won't complicate and increase food prices and make it sort of an argument for not doing support of biofuel. So what I'm trying to say is that the relationship between Europe and the US is going to be not just where I'm going to conclude defense, security challenges. It's also going to be these other many new issues like environment, energy, and climate policies, hopefully, and even more so with our policies, given our government's country's positions, it seems to be, and I'm only describing this, that it's easier for us to address a wider, deeper cooperation with the present administration than with other previous administrations, simply because the priority of these issues, environment, energy, climate, is just higher with this democratic leadership in Congress and this administration. We, of course, have no say in US internal politics, but we know when we can make more or less business, and this seems to be one major change of strategy in the US that allows us to engage more with the US, both politically and commercially. Let me conclude where diplomats normally would be all the time, namely on the foreign policy challenges between Europe and Denmark and the US. The biggest challenges of ours today is counterterrorism and non-proliferation. We would in Denmark also highlight in that context our more broad approach to foreign policy making, development policy. We are a small country of 5.5 million, but we've always been very proud with a group of other like-minded countries to do a very substantial development assistance. Half of it through the UN and the UN families, the other half bilaterally. We would give about $3.5 billion every year. That's about 0.85% of our GDP. We would strive to even do better. We are very proud of the fact that the OECD every year ranks the quality of development assistance, and we Danes are very fortunate because we've been, I think, number one, sometimes with the Dutch or the Swedes in competition with us. And it's a very, we would call it sophisticated development assistance policy, wherein we give program assistance, not just humanitarian assistance, not just simple projects, but overall programs that really helps governments in developing countries, the poorest, to make sure that their development efforts are really sort of articulated and more holistically seen and supported. Development policy, therefore, as a soft policy, has to go with the other types of foreign policy, other types of diplomacy, and we Danes think that we are doing quite well in supporting the international efforts on both accounts, both when it comes to counter-proliferation, non-proliferation, and counter-terrorism. And I will spend a few minutes concluding that our efforts in Afghanistan, for us, is the peak of a process which we started coming out of the Cold War. We sent a ship off, a corvette, to the first Gulf War in '91, when our Queen was here on a state visit celebrating the 200 years of diplomatic ties. We were very active in the Balkans, both in the UN missions and in the NATO missions. It was really a sad moment, a sad time for Europe in the 90s to be at war inside Europe again, to need to stop some Europeans, Serbs, from doing what they were perpetrating, ethnic cleansing of Kosovo Albanians. Really a terrible chapter for Europe. And until the Clinton administration finally decided, fortunately, to go into Europe again and help us get things cleared, we finally got the Dayton agreements. And we were with that policy. We were even using our American-bought F-16s trying to bomb some Europeans, preventing them from making ethnic cleansing. A terrible history. Europe is not a continent that should reproach others for making mistakes. We have certainly our issues and problems. We are in Afghanistan with almost 750 soldiers. We're in the Helmand province where the real fighting with the Talibanis are taking place, is taking place. We are unfortunately suffering many casualties. We've lost more than 30 Danish young soldiers in that fight. But we do believe in this. And the reason for this is very important for us to state, especially here in the US. We were, until 1990, a classical European defense equipped nation. We have, since the end of the Cold War, realized that if there is no threat from the Soviet Union and its successor state, the Russian Federation, we have to transform our military from what it was, a huge, not huge, we Danes haven't never had a huge army. We've sometimes had a huge navy, and we've made good with that, but we never had a huge army. But a classical European territorial defense into what is now needed, namely rapid deployable defense. So we have the ambition to have 2,000 Danish soldiers equipped and trained in the best possible way to go protect Danish national security and borders and sovereignty, exactly where it is at stake. And that today, unfortunately, whether one likes it or not, is in Afghanistan. So Danes are supportive of this. They see this mission as very, very important. Our former Prime Minister, the Prime Minister I called Rasmussen II, is now the Secretary General of NATO as a consequence, partly because of that, and we actually probably have more support in the Danish population than there is in UK for the mission in Afghanistan, and even certainly here in the US. I think Obama is facing some opposition from his own party's left because of the surge in Afghanistan. We Danes think it's the right policy to pursue because it will give us a chance to really get that military upper hand that we need to have before we can do, hopefully, what we really believe in Denmark is a very necessary component, the combination of civilian military tools. The kind of foreign policy we want to see, the kind of security policy we like to see, has to be what we Danes call multilateral. Many Americans believe that they are multilateralist and believe in a really multilateral approach, which would have to be sort of defined and adopted by the UN Security Council especially. We would think that we do it even more wholehearted than you, because, and let me give you one small example. When our previous Prime Minister Rasmussen II was trying to meet with some of the potentially influential people in this administration, Obama's, and so trying to play it safe, having some of the key potential players for a McCain administration, and ask these very experienced, insightful American security policy experts what they meant by being multilateral. And they gave, I'm just trying to say it in my words, the answer that I will always give you Americans when you try to be multilateral, namely that the US would always be multilateral as long as it would be in the US interest. We Danes will do it even when it's not in our interest, because we're a small state and we have to accept that there is a majority sometimes that we're not part of, and we will then still fight for our ideas. But we can also associate ourselves with a defeat politically and accept that we cannot run the world without conversations, and sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. What I'm trying to say is, in conclusion, that we are therefore happy whenever we can have what is the first best mandate in the UN Security Council. We didn't have that for the Kosovo operation, unfortunately. The ethnic, the humanitarian intervention we did in Kosovo was without the right UN backing. We got that afterwards. That's some kind of consolation, but it's not really what you want. In Iraq, we didn't have it. According to many, we thought we had it. I was the head of the foreign ministry. We produced with our legal department a draft bill to the Danish government that the government accepted and the parliament, a majority of, accepted, which had a very simple reasoning that we would go to war with Danish troops in Iraq because of violations of the old Iraqi regime's violations of UN Security Council resolutions that was already existing. We were even using the precedent that we had in 1998, where we were ready to go into Iraq because of the exact same. So it was not because of a reasoning, explicit, formal reasoning about regime change or weapons of mass control. It was simply because of violations of UN Security Council resolutions. Let me conclude here. I don't want to be talking too much about security policy. I think it's natural to conclude a presentation of US-Danish future relationship on security policy, because the most important sentence I will utter here today is that for us Danes, the US represents for all the foreseeable future the strategic ally and partner for us in defense of our most important values, our democracy, our human rights, our rule of law society. That cannot change, however different the world economy will compose and develop itself in the future. We Europeans, Danes, others will have this strategic alliance with the US, and that's really the bedrock of our whole fortunate conditions today. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope I have provoked some, or that I have inspired others to come with some good remarks, questions. I really hope that I can have the opportunity to discuss a few of these issues with you. Thank you. Sure.
So His Excellency has agreed to take some questions. We're a small room, but because we're podcasting, we ask that you just wait for the microphone. And then tell us your name and what you're studying so we know who you are as well.
Yeah, my name is Paul Russell. I'm studying international relations. You mentioned Denmark's policy towards free trade. Is Denmark doing anything to limit the EU cap funding and lower agricultural subsidies so that they can then use those funds to go towards things like climate control?
European agricultural policy and common agricultural policy is a long history. The oldest European common policy is the European agricultural policy. I could give a very long, very boring lecture of why the US and EU is at loggerheads on its agricultural policies. We would think that the US is subsidizing at least as much its agriculture as we Europeans are ours. We think that, and you will maybe find this unattractive to hear, but we think that you've been better at branding us Europeans as having a more subsidized agricultural policy. We don't think that's true. We just think you are smarter, especially at communication. Having said that, I think I should tell you a very small, very important story. When we had the presidency, Denmark, in 2002, by coincidence, that was almost the 10-year anniversary of the adoption of the Copenhagen criteria at a Copenhagen summit, EU summit in June '93, wherein we defined in Europe, in EU, what political and economic criteria the new East European countries coming out of communism should fulfill to become members of the European Union. One of the biggest challenges for the successful conclusion of those accession negotiations and treaties with each of the new member states, 10 they were at the time, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and so on, was that the French president, at an extraordinary summit in Brussels in October, before we would have the final dealing on these enlargement negotiations, wanted to ensure that these new members of the European Union would not have all the same rights that could deprive France or French farmers of some of the existing rights and incomes and returns from the common agricultural policy. So we, as a presidency country, actually agreed to that kind of deal that will only expire in a couple of years and preserve intact the structure of the common European agricultural policy with its subsidies and its drawbacks and so on. So we are as responsible for that shape and content of the EU agricultural policy as everyone else. Having said all that, we Danes would probably have liked a different agricultural policy. We are so much free traders and believers in ourselves, and especially all those very efficient Danes who do farming today, that we think we could live with any common European agricultural policy as long as it would be one common policy. So with or without subsidies, we would be competitive, and we would like to take everyone on, Dutchmen, Poles, French, whatever, as long as it would be one common level playing field. But that's not the exact same situation in other countries. France is a very refined country, wonderful partner inside the European Union and in NATO, for us, very important partner, given its traditions, its precision, and everything that you know. They, though, have a different political system and agriculture that doesn't allow this kind of scale and economies and profitability that we have apparently a possibility for even in small kingdom of Denmark. So you have to take that into account when you make a common policy. There are some compromises made, and they have not made that complete transition that we have done in Denmark, where we were probably 20% of Danes employed in agriculture sector in when I was born 100 years ago. And today we have 0.5% Danes employed in agriculture, but producing maybe 20 times as much, and it's efficient, which creates other problems. But the French have a different structure and a different history, so they haven't gone through that kind of transition. So you have to try to understand European policies, agricultural policies, like when you try to understand the US, you also have sectors in which you have to make US federal policies take the diversity of the US as a continent into consideration. I hope that was an eloquent defense of our subsidized agricultural policies. So we have not used any funds or wanted to reallocate. We will always strive for making it the most viable, liberal, commercially oriented agricultural policy. But we have to be reasonable within such a big European Union.
I just want to thank you for coming. My name is Petersen. I'm studying international relations. And my question has to do with non-proliferation. The U.S. is obviously taking some measures to decrease the amount of nuclear warheads and other weapons of mass destruction. But they're also taking a defensive stance where they're trying to implement a BMD system in Europe. So my question is, how do the Danish feel about the ballistic missile defense system? And has the U.S. approached Denmark as far as potential site, and just the feelings there about that?
We've been very fond of and supportive of President Obama's Prague speech, within which he outlined the Grand Zero vision of his. We also understand that he did add to that Grand Zero vision of nuclear arms to be reduced completely, not in his lifetime, he said. And so we see all the steps that are being taken exactly in that realm, between a very ambitious no nuclear weapons and not in his lifetime sort of interval. And we think that the new follow-on treaty that he's going to sign in Prague is going to be a step in that right direction between the US and Russia. I think your question is quite brilliant, because it's true that it is a surprise to many Europeans, probably more in Germany than in Denmark, that this president and his administration, given exactly that inclination and that articulated policies towards nuclear arms, and also the realism in that pursuit of that security policy objective, that this administration is doing maybe more than even the Bush administration and Clinton in his second term was persuaded to do in terms of national missile defense. But I think the good reason for that is the national intelligence estimates that has been issued in the US during the last years, and the national intelligence estimate that we'll be seeing, and all the reports coming from IAEA, and all the common knowledge that we have about the Iranian regime's real intent, namely to equip themselves with nuclear weaponry. And therefore missile defense is by us Danes seen as something that is unfortunately, regrettably, necessary as a defense without nuclear components, unlike the Russian missile defense, which contains old-fashioned nuclear components because it's short-range missile and nuclear weapons. We Danes were, together with the Brits, some of the first who made a bilateral missile defense agreement. I myself have spent quite a lot of time negotiating the one we did and signed with Pavel in Greenland. And the history is simple because of Greenland that I just alluded to. On the very northern top western coast, you have Thule Air Base. And the US has for a long time had a ballistic missile early warning radar up there that, when you see on the globe, exactly overlooks not just Russia, which was useful once, not so relevant anymore, but also the Middle East and Iran and North Korea. So the ability to track missile launches from Thule and from the UK-based Fylingdale radar is now embodied in bilateral agreements between Denmark and the US. So given that history that I could speak at very great lengths about between US, Denmark, Greenland, we've had a need for deeper political understanding and comprehension of what is at stake in missile defense. I think the wisdom of the new ballistic missile defense agreements of the US is that it is one that hopefully in the end will protect and defend all friends and allies in Europe, including Greenland, and that it is more flexible, more dependent on, my interlocutors in the administration would say, the threat that emerges. So therefore, the name of this administration's defense in the ballistic missile defense, phased ballistic missile approach. So if the threat in the coming years is to evolve along the lines that most of us, unfortunately, regrettably, expect the Iranians to produce a substance of, the US will have to build up this system. In the NATO summit in Prague later this year, we will hopefully, as an alliance, all countries agree to a NATO-based missile defense concept. There will be discussions on this. This is, for now, a subject for insiders and experts like myself, but it will later on, rightly so, but also unfortunately so, be a political discourse. Is Europe really, is NATO really now, November 2010, making missile defenses, and wasn't the Cold War long gone? Wasn't this Ambassador Petersen talking about all the great benefits of the end of the Cold War and so on? Yes, but there are some countries out there that still, unfortunately, allows us to have non-proliferation as one of the biggest strategic threats to us all, and as an existential threat to some of our partners and friends in the Middle East. We should take one more at least.
My name is Ford Stevenson. I'm a retired student of political science. If you were an influential politician here in the United States, what would you do to try and convince the American populace that climate change was a valid issue?
I really have spent a lot of time here the last 5 years, especially on climate policy, energy policy, environmental discussion, and it has been extremely gratifying to see that the one issue that you Americans have changed your attitudes and approach to the most, to my mind, seems to be exactly climate and energy. We're not yet there, I'm afraid, despite all the good efforts by many, President Obama, Al Gore, John Kerry, all the good politicians we've had actually visiting Greenland. We've had more US legislators the last 4 years visiting Greenland because of exactly that question than we've had in the whole history. So we started by having, I think, a good agreement with Senator John McCain, Lindsey Graham, Secretary Champion Martinez, and we went to Greenland for 3.5 days with their spouses and really witnessed climate change. We then had the speaker, Nancy Pelosi, and a big delegation of hers, including many prominent members, Ed Markey, a very prominent politician. We've had Barbara Boxer, Hearst Committee in the Senate, Environmental Protection Works. And they all sort of came and witnessed climate change. So that was our part of, as another foreign country's representation here in the US, to assist and be of avail in that conversation that I think is gradually persuading more and more to believe in the reality of this threat to our global community. We've also done a lot to team up with US companies and Danish companies who will work on energy projects, renewable energy, energy efficiency, very, very important. We've teamed up with a lot of NGOs in Washington, D.C. and throughout the US that has been very gratifying, very rewarding. We've met more people on a very direct mission than we probably have on any other issue, maybe except Afghanistan and some foreign policy issues. So I think the receptiveness and the openness and the gradual movement of the US society and its many different actors, political, commercial, NGOs, is really there happening. Not always in one constant line towards progress. And we did not do that as well in Denmark. Irrespective of all the brilliant results we've accomplished, we could have done even better. We are nowhere near perfect. We should have done much better had we had the insight and knowledge we have today, politically and commercially. So I think the process is happening. I think there's a lot of regional cooperation between many states. RGGI is one. We've seen a lot of governors team up with companies and support this cause. So I don't really think that I could imagine that we could have done much more than we have. Our environmental minister, who became Energy and Climate Minister, who's now the EU Commissioner on Climate, Connie Hedegaard, has been here the last 5 years when I've been here, I think 14 times, to exactly do this network that you describe. What would you do to continue and participate that conversation with many different parts of the US society? So she's been here as many times as the Danish Defense Secretary. And I think that's hopefully a good way to conclude that this is exactly the examples that sort of describes the future relationship between us. A lot of defense, unfortunately, still in many ways, and a lot of new areas where we are moving toward the right direction. I think the US eventually will be there, where we Europeans apparently have had an easier access to approach these costly but right and necessary energy policies that in the end will pay off. And I think you will see a lot of challenge from emerging markets because they're pursuing this as well as we are. And if you look at the Chinese energy policy that people like myself will have to study in great depth, they are very, very smart, and they will, if not persuade you, challenge you to do even better in energy policy in the future. Thank you so much for your attention. I really enjoyed the remarks. I'm sorry I spoke so long and did have so little time for remarks and discussion. Thank you so much.